Okay, today we have Dr. Lachlan James with us, and Lachlan is a lecturer and researcher at Latrobe University and is in charge of the Masters of Strength and Conditioning program, which is a pretty new program, correct?
Yeah, that's right. So we just had our first intake this year, and we're just going to build bigger and better over the coming years. So pretty excited.
Were you behind the impetus to build that program in?
Yeah, I think as these things are always kind of a team effort, so we brought together a group of people to kind of envision what it would look like and put it together and get it up and running. So we certainly saw that there was a place in the market for it. You know, with our master's program, it's designed for perhaps those that are recent undergraduates that maybe haven't had that time in the trenches. And so it's designed to really upregulate those and give them chances to work with athletes, work in clubs. There's a lot of face-to-face delivery combined with some online delivery as well, so that by the end of the day, they're ready and capable to work in a high-performance setting. But at the same time, we also cater for those that are already in industry as well. So that was kind of the drive behind it.
So just to give some context for this conversation, do you want to give a bit of a background about your education and your journey to where you are now?
Yeah, sure. Well, how much time do we have? It's been a bit of a journey, and it's certainly probably not the typical journey. So I'll happy to tell you a bit about my story. So as you mentioned, right now I'm a lecturer and researcher at Latrobe University in sports science and strength and conditioning. So that's kind of my role now. I've got a project sort of embedded with different sporting organisations and clubs, including, say, the AFL, Super Rugby.
Do you do stuff still with mixed martial arts as well?
That was what my PhD was in, but not so much anymore these days. Okay. So I've sort of spun away from that a little bit, but I'll tell you a bit about that as I kind of get to it. So, so that's sort of where my research is at now, and I lecture into the Masters of Strength and Conditioning, and I've got research students as well, so PhD students that are embedded in different sporting organisations that we're working on projects together with. So it's kind of what I'm doing now, but I'm not a typical sort of academic or researcher.
What do you say there?
Yeah. So I had 10 years in industry before I moved into academia. So I'm from Brisbane originally, so born and raised in Brizzy, and then in roughly 2005, after I finished my undergrads, that's how long ago it was.
Isn't it after you finished your bodybuilding career?
Oh, no, I don't know what you're talking about there. But after 2005, so I'm like, all right, I did my undergrad at QUT, and I was just kind of ready. I was done. I wanted to get out. I just wanted to train
Who was
myself.
Who was there at the time?
No one I would remember, that's for sure, because I never turned up.
Oh, really?
So I was probably an average undergrad student, but I didn't really care. So I just wanted to be in the gym. So I finished my undergrad in 2005, and I left Australia, moved overseas. So I moved to the Cayman Islands. I was there for a year, worked at
Were you tax evading?
Yeah, well, I know.
Hanging out with the rich and famous.
Well, so not only was there zero income tax, but I was also earning Caymanian dollars, which is indexed to the US dollar at the time. It was like 1.3 US, which when you take it back to Aussie dollars,
it's crazy.
Yeah, I know, it's good money.
So why did you come back?
Well, so I was there for a year. But when you come from Queensland, like a small kind of tropical island, probably doesn't impress you so much. So
it's tiny, yeah.
40. I think it was 40,000 roughly. Yeah, this was a long time ago. But
what were you doing there?
Well, I was traveling, so you'd never left Australia, kind of younger. So I was 22 at the time. Yeah. So I just wanted to get out and travel, and fortunate enough to get a job so I was offered a job before I left Australia. I did actually have some family living over there at the time as well. So that made the transition a bit easier. So I worked at World Gym there. So, and that was kind of some PT stuff. And then I was there for a year. I'm like, okay, it's time to progress on. And so I moved to Vancouver, Canada. And so, had the open work permit agreement there with Australia and Canada. So back then you just had 1 year. So you had 1 year where you could work wherever you wanted as long as you're under the age of 30. Since then it's changed, and you could just keep renewing that 1 year until you're 30. So you could do it sort of indefinitely, but the time was 1 year. Moved over there and I got a job with a multidiscipline sort of exercise science company. And I was doing the strength and conditioning component there. So that's where I started to tap into a bit more of the athlete side of things. So I was there for 4 or 5 years, and I got a work permit with them as well. And then I became permanent resident in Canada. And then it gave me the opportunity to sort of do whatever I wanted to do over there. So I opened up my own strength and conditioning organisation in Vancouver. And as part of that, was kind of ready to upgrade my skills. I was ready to go back and study again. So through the University of Queensland, I was able to do a master's degree while I was still in Canada. So I did that with Emma Beckman and Vince Kelly, and a little research project associated with that. And I really enjoyed that. And not long after that, I did the ECU Masters of Strength and Conditioning as well.
Yeah, which we share in.
Yeah. So I think I would have finished that in like 2013.
When did you finish, John?
Around there.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that was a great experience. And through those experiences, while I had my little business over there in Vancouver, I kind of thought, I like it. I really like it a lot. It's kind of the research and academic side. Practice is hard over time. It's kind of grueling. You're scraping the snow off your car in Vancouver in the early mornings, and you're getting up, and it's a bit of a grind. And so I thought, okay, it's time for me to maybe decide on what I'd like to do. Well, the PhD seems to be the way to go. And during that time, I was, Georges St. Pierre, who's a Canadian MMA fighter, or was one of the biggest names in the sport, and I was in Canada at the time. So MMA was a big thing, and I had a few clients that were involved in that as well. So that made me think that could be a pretty good PhD research project. So I moved back to Brisbane, Australia. Did my PhD at the University of Queensland with Emma Beckman, Vince Kelly, and then Greg Haff through ECU, investigating MMA athletes. So I did that, and then had to make a decision. Do I want to go the academic route, or do I want to go kind of the industry coaching route, like keep doing what I was doing? And pretty early on, I'm like, I had the opportunity to go back and do some coaching, and I'm like, yeah, no, that's not for me. I'm done with that. I really kind of like the research design.
Do you think that your experience has changed the way that you investigate things?
Yeah. So my practical experience, absolutely, because that's where all my questions came from.
Yeah.
And still does, right? So
do you have a lot of interaction still then with coaches in working in the industry too?
Oh yeah. So that's a really big part of my job now, because a lot of my research at the moment is embedded within organizations. So as I was saying before, whether it's Super Rugby or institutes of sport, other professional organizations, it's there to answer a question that's driven by the club.
Okay.
So that they'll have a research question. Sometimes you have to sort of work with them to articulate what that is. And then my sort of role is to help them answer that research question. So it's predominantly driven by the needs of the organization. And then we look to support that. So that's probably the vast majority of my research at the moment. And then in addition to that, to supplement that, I'm looking forward to getting some more lab-based stuff up and running now, which is a little bit more controlled, a bit more driven, maybe less so by the coaching environment, maybe more so by the body of research.
How do you think that then influences practice? Like I always have this conundrum as a coach that a lot of the times you feel like the research that's done, particularly in the controlled environment, doesn't necessarily cross over. And you would get that from the practical experience you've got. You always tend to find that the stuff, and sometimes it's hidden, like these organizations, say like Super Rugby, they don't necessarily always want that stuff published, right? Or if they do, they don't share a lot of the details of what happened. But it's probably more relevant if you're working in that sport. So how do you see the interplay between those two things? And is that, as I said, I asked you before about your experience, how do you then necessarily like design that so that you think, okay, this is going to be very, very useful for people in the field, even though I'm not taking that research question from them?
Yeah, so we're really lucky in Australia in that when you're doing research with our professional sporting organisation, institutes of sport, part of the agreement, that we can sort of come together with the club is that this is research that's going to get published and put out there for everybody. And there's not a lot of intellectual property that people are hanging on to really tightly. It's different in the States. Yeah, that's where everything's done.
I'm sorry, I'm probably not talking so much in Australia, but you see it a lot overseas. The soccer clubs are like this.
That's right.
You see it a lot in
So you're not reading too many published articles on NFL, right, or MLB or NHL, right? Because everything's in house. There's a lot of money involved, and that's how they roll. Australia, it's different. So we're really fortunate that way. And so what happens? You get a research project that's then really applicable, and you think, okay, I feel like I could implement that in my environment because it was implemented in an applied environment. The flip side is you don't have as many controls. So when you get some sort of a result, it's hard to nail down exactly what the cause of that was. So that's sort of the flip side of it. So when you do your lab-based research to kind of really dial in on kind of a cause of an effect, and you control the other variables. So for example, like I did a major part of my PhD thesis was I did a lab-based intervention study. So we had EMG and ultrasound and 3D motion capture training study. And we were able to control a lot of things. And what we were able to show was, and confirmed from some previous literature too, is that those who are stronger are going to show superior adaptations to power training than those who are weaker. So you give stronger people a training, power training intervention.
That would have made Greg happy.
Yeah. Well, it was my advisor on that one, one of my advisors. So it was pretty interesting, right? So as a result, though, so that was a lab-based study, but it still has real-world applicability. So what you take from that is you go, okay, it's really important that we develop a strong foundation of strength for emphasizing plyometric training. Now, that doesn't mean you can't do plyometric training, it just means the emphasis shifts, because once they get stronger, the adaptation is going to be even better still. And you can apply that principle in any sort of environment, even though it was a lab-based training intervention.
Do you think that there are limitations to taking that approach?
Well, there's pros and cons to both, right? And you need both as well. So the argument for doing the lab-based stuff.
Oh, no, I'm talking about like the application of strength.
Oh, sorry.
As a foundation. Do you think that there's limitations to going down that path?
Well, there's a time cost benefit to everything that you do, particularly in training.
I don't even mean from time cost. I mean from like a physiological change perspective. Do you think I've heard a number of coaches, actually like my background's in track. I don't know if Jack mentioned this before we spoke, but there's a number of top-level coaches who will preferentially limit the amount of strength training that someone will go down. And these are international coaches, until the moment they believe that they're ready to be exposed to that stressor. Mainly because strength training in itself, as you know, can be extremely taxing on people. And some of them have even spoken about the idea that if you expose them to it earlier, you potentially limit the positive adaptations that they get to, say, things like muscular tendinous units for high velocity tasks. So I sort of thought it would be interesting to ask you the question of like, do you think there's actually limitations, or do you think that they're posing anecdotal kind of processes that haven't been borne out in any evidence?
Yeah, well, you have to go back to your fundamental training principles, right, of the general adaptation syndrome and your response to training, so progressive overload. So if you're resistance training applying progressive overload sensibly, then the toll on the body is pretty minor compared to the stress you get from the sport, even if it's a non-contact sport like track, right? So going through a controlled squat will overload the neuromuscular system, but it won't to the extent of doing hundreds or thousands of impacts or foot strikes, or having 220 kilo men running at you at 8 meters per second, right? That's overloading the neuromuscular system. So you're saying, we can't do a controlled squat with a moderately heavy weight with good form. So, that you got to take that on board. Does it limit, adaptations to high velocity training? Well, no, it does the opposite. So if you're weaker and you do heavy strength training, you get stronger and you get high velocity responses for free as a result. In addition to that, you get superior adaptations once you're strong to high velocity training.
Just talking more about power, John and I often look at power as a spectrum where you can think about, are you trying to maximize, say, watts in terms of your force by velocity, or do you need to actually consider the ability to produce a really high amount of force within a very short contact time, particularly in response to a high ground reaction force? So the example being of like, let's say a counter movement jump, there's a very open window to how long you keep contact to produce that force, as opposed to, say, high velocity sprinting where your contact time is
going to be limited.
Yeah, very 0.1 second. And thinking about the transfer, I think particularly then too of like thinking about strength and having a foundation of strength, or building up, say, power in that sort of late RFD stage, how much that actually transfers into that real early RFD, and particularly when you have a very short contact time and you have to overcome a really high ground reaction force. Do you look at it from that perspective of separating out power based on those variables?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's sort of really a key focus of probably my research and my students' research right now. So we sort of call them strength qualities, right? And understanding which ones are distinct and which ones are similar. So when you know which strength qualities are distinct, you know how to isolate them and test them and train them and then connect them to, relevant sport. And if you know a group are the same, then you can probably go, okay, we can just focus on one of these because it's going to give us the same information. So then to answer your question, are they interrelated? It seems like if you're looking at the interrelationship between all of these different types of strength and power metrics, you might go, okay, what seems to be revealed when you look at this empirically or statistically are these factors. You've got reactive strength, which is your fast contact, less than 200 milliseconds. So your drop jump, quick reaction, quick tap, less than 200 milliseconds, that's going to be a particular sort of strength quality, and that's going to be closely related to you sprinting. Now, different from that is, say, a counter movement jump, right? So you look at that externally, people go, oh, that's fast. But the movement time is quite long. It could be up to a second, So it might be 5 times longer than that quick foot strike when you're doing reactive strength.
Or like a depth jump, exactly, in comparison.
Yeah, that's right. So, and this is Warren Young's really classic early work, is those two qualities, like the correlation between them is pretty low, right? So it's not as tightly correlated. So I think there's might be 30% shared variance between your ability to do a counter movement jump, long, and your ability to do a quick tap reactive strength, short or fast. Very limited relationship. And training interventions over time, the adaptations to those two qualities can be quite distinct. So you need to target one over the other. So there are 2 forms of strength qualities. Another one you'll have will be your heavy dynamic strength, which is, like your 1RM, your 3RM. That's probably no surprise. And then different to that again is your maximal isometric strength. So we're talking about your mid-thigh pull or the isometric squat. So they seem to, those isometric tests, which are still multi-joint, whole body, have relationships to on-field performance. That seems to has relationships to dynamic strength, but they're more different than they are similar, right? And then within that maximal isometric strength, so your peak force that you might take out of that, you've got your rate of force development, right? And that's another question, something that you raised too, so the timing of it. So that force time curve, you're looking at the slope, you probably want to get the early stage of that slope. The later stage you get, so let's say, peak force can occur anywhere from, 1 second through to the end of the trial, which, maybe 2 or 3 seconds. But let's say it occurs after 1 second. You do your rate of force development, how you can calculate them to different time points. As soon as you calculate a time point beyond, say, 150 milliseconds, let's say rate of force development or peak or force at 200 milliseconds or 250 milliseconds, that really contains pretty much the same information as the peak force. It doesn't tell you that much difference. So if you're doing well, peak force, you probably do well on that late RFD measure. Yep. So what you want is something different. You want that really fast RFD measure early on to see that you've got a different quality there in your hands.
Yeah, and this is something I think it's interesting too, because I think of, say, long-term heavy resistance training. One of the physiological adaptations you're going to see is more pure type 2A fibers, typically speaking. But when you think about that real elastic component of being able to produce a high amount of force within a very short time frame, from a physiological perspective, you really want more of those 2X fibers. And I know there is some research, I can't think of that hurdler's name, that they did
Colin Jackson.
The muscle fiber typology, where the amount of 2X fibers he had was actually still
here's an
high.
example, and he's one of the examples that people use for that, because he actually didn't start, he was already world class, and he didn't start resistance training until the age of 21. And one of the theories that went around was that it allowed him to conserve and actually consolidate, particularly the size of his type 2X fibers and develop them so that he had hypertrophy preferentially within those fibers. And that once he then added strength training, there was the benefit there. That's why I was kind of like alluding to whether the separation, particularly in those very high velocity movements in certain aspects of sport, do you need to be careful with when you put in, say, heavier maximal resistance training, because it starts to shift away from some of those qualities?
Yeah, so you want to look at the interrelationship, and then you want to periodize as well. So the question becomes, if you get someone stronger, will they show better adaptations to their sporting stimulus versus if you didn't get them stronger? And you can be pretty confident that if they have a stronger base, then they'll show preferential adaptations.
Have you, and this is my ignorance, so I apologize, but have you gone to the level of profiling prior to the application to kind of identify whether you're getting those, as you said, those benefits?
When you say profiling, you mean profiling different athletes in terms of their
say stuff.
fast twitch.
The example is someone who's very high fast twitch typology versus someone who's a bit more mixed versus someone who's in the endurance capabilities. What actually happens when you apply that?
So it starts to get a bit outside my area of expertise when we're looking at banging out.
I'm sure you have knowledge in this area.
Yeah, so you need to understand, I've been part of studies that have had biopsies done, so I've had my fair share of them.
That's never fun.
Pleasant,
yeah. So the bottom line is that they're hard to do, they're expensive, and they're not easy studies to conduct. So there might not be. It might not be so easy to sort of conduct a pre-profiling ahead of time.
Even that's obviously in the very controlled element. Do you have
just from like actual clinical?
Yeah. Do you have things from your practical experience that allow you to kind of start identifying those features, whether they're in the actual performance outcomes that someone has on different tests? I know that obviously there's lots of different indexes that people use.
Well, you often talk about anthropometrics too, John, don't you?
Yeah, I do. Like I always think about that. You can typically tell. Sometimes based on someone's anthropometric profile, it's not always 100% accurate, but you start to get an idea of like whether someone's going to be more towards that very high strength dominant or they're going to be very elastic. And to me, it's always interesting because you tend to find that their responses to things like, say, heavy resistance training actually varies quite a bit.
Yeah.
They get benefits, but the amount of fatigue and how they manage that and actually how they create movement tends to be different. So, yeah, I just didn't know whether you had some insights for people because you've obviously got the literature understanding that we don't.
Well, no, certainly from a clinical applied standpoint, you've got grinders out there and they can kind of just keep grinding out. Yeah, exactly. You've heard the analogies of workhorse versus your Maseratis. And those workhorses can kind of grind out some heavy, slow reps and they're probably predisposed to putting on good amounts of muscle size and just basic strength, which is great. So we're talking within the realm of strength qualities. We're not sort of talking about anaerobic or endurance adaptations. Then you got those that are just springy, and they're springy and they're bouncy and they're fast and they die in the ass pretty quick. So and then they need a longer time to recover too. So I absolutely see that. And if you're able to bang out some biopsies, you'd probably see certainly differences in fiber type there.
Well, it made me think. I don't know if you've heard of. I've pulled up the articles by Levens. They published an article last year looking at muscle fiber typology as a risk factor for hamstring strains in football or soccer players. They actually did scans where they looked at the carnosine. I think it was carnosine content of the muscle because that's directly related to the fiber typology. So higher carnosine content typically related to more fast twitch profile. And their findings actually found that your typical fast twitch fiber profile is more predisposed to hamstring strains. And it makes a lot of sense when you think about the actual stress and strain that they're putting through their system. But I think the other interesting thing that I commonly think about with regards to the transfer of strength to power and particularly elastic performance is not just the actual capacity of the muscle to produce force, but that dynamic muscle architecture. Because obviously one of the things you see with those very elastic profiles is they create that decoupling between tendon lengthening and then use that as a spring and utilize that elastic energy potential while you see the muscle act much more isometrically, which makes a lot of sense when you think about having that real type 2X profile to be able to control the lengthening and shortening of the tendon within that very short time period. But it seems like that's an area from a research perspective versus clinical perspective that there's still a bit of a gap in terms of understanding. Is there the potential of interference where you create a transition of 2X to 2A that may impede that ability to produce high amounts of force within those really narrow contact times?
Yes, this is a good question. So the expression of strength and within each strength quality is multifactorial. So you've got the fiber type contribution, and that'll be one part of it. Then you have other
All
contributions
the
as
neurological
well.
components of connective tissue.
That's right. So you've got nervous system that's going to drive that as well. You've got the behaviour of the series elastic elements too. You've got maybe a bit of cross-sectional area depending on its relative contribution as well. You've got coordination. You've got probably the timing of muscle activation rather than just the magnitude as well. So it's multifactorial. So what you might say is you might go, okay, although we're going to lose a bit over here, we might lose some. Anytime you do anything, you're going to lose type 2X fibers, right? As soon as you get up and walk. So like old people seem to have like a high amount of type 2X fibers, right?
They're mainly the hybridome, aren't they, typically?
Yeah.
Where they're more the 2A,
Yes.
2X1s.
So they can kind of swing, right?
Yeah. They're not getting
that's the
hypertrophy
purest.
of type 2X.
Yeah.
And so, but what happens anytime you do any sort of activity, it's going to get pulled away from that.
You see the same in the astronauts too, I know.
Yeah, that's right. And so what will happen is you're going to weigh it up, right? Okay. So that means as a result, maybe I lose a little bit of 2X and they become a bit more type 2AE. But as a result, I get all these other benefits as well.
Well, and clearly that has a real application to a lot of field-based sports, particularly where they need force-producing capacity in many different directions, many different planes, and not to mention they've got a contact, like in terms of opposition and things like that. So typically you're going to need a lot more diversity in your force-producing capacity to deal with all the actual physical stresses associated with the complex sport.
So here's another example of a similar thing, right? A paper came out probably 5, 6, 7, 8 years ago, Jacob Burke, in homogeneous quadricep hypertrophy, something like that. So anyway, the general gist was doing ballistic versus strength, going to end up with hypertrophy in different parts of the quadricep, depending on what you did. And as a result, if you do heavy strength, it's going to end up with quadricep hypertrophy in a certain area that might impact the moment of inertia when you're running, and that might be a problem. And then I had a biomechanist say to me, as a result, you probably shouldn't do heavy squats because of inertia.
A little bit reductionist.
And so I said, well, that part is true, but that's one of 5 or 6 other mechanisms, part of the whole, that allows heavy strength training to transfer to sprint performance. And those other mechanisms are the other ones we just spoke about, and they outweigh that small negative result that you might get from some sort of inhomogeneous quadricep hypertrophy that impedes the moment of inertia when you're trying to run.
But do you think that's a bit of an issue at times too, where you get caught up in some of the nuanced adaptations at a micro level and you sort of forget the bigger picture of like, why are we doing resistance training? Well, it's to actually build, well, one, strength capacity, and therefore we know that then the system has more capacity to do either more particular actions or tolerate more physical stress because of the fact that they've built that individual capacity. Do you think there's sometimes an issue of becoming too micro and I don't know what the word I'm looking for is, too much focusing on the micro component and think instead of
zoom out a little bit, and get understanding that.
Like, it's not the thing of I often look at too. I think we briefly talked about this a few years ago when I first met you about flexibility. I think you brought up I think it was the Newso article.
Oh yeah,
and
that's right.
I know that,
smart ass paper.
Yeah, and him just saying, it should be completely neglected. And I look at that and going, well, are you seeing sometimes the bigger picture of, let's say, if someone does have poor flexibility and you want to improve it, we know that stretching is actually a really valuable thing to do. And I wonder if it's the same issue sometimes when you look at, say, strength adaptation and thinking of, are you getting a bit too caught up in the nuanced detail?
Yeah, rather than realizing this person would benefit from having improved strength qualities across the spectrum.
Yeah, so this is what's going to happen 90% of the time in the real world with the people you're dealing with. They just kind of need some general strength training, even in an athletic setting as well. It's not till you really get to the high performers that you start to need to dial it in very specifically and target specific adaptations based on the demands of their sport. But before you start getting specific, even with higher level athletes, they have to have gone through sort of some stages of
that sort of
progression,
general
right?
preparatory sort of phase, yeah.
But even long-term development too. So I think that the really specified training, which is probably what we like to look at as researchers and even academic applied researchers, that's what we like to look at because it's kind of fun. But that's really only applies to sort of the upper echelon, or else people are going to get general adaptations, right? And it's not till you become more trained that you need to really dial it in, because if you give somebody that's quite trained just a general training plan, they're going to see no adaptations. You need to start to specify exactly what you're looking for. We need to start going reactive strict. We need to start going high rate of force development.
Yeah, I think even that's part of their training history. Like I know, John, when you have young sprinters, you're going to develop more general capacities before you start to expose them to certain particular movements or in the gym, correct?
Yeah, of course. It's obviously like, and it just depends on whether you think that some of those features, what's the value of some of those features, and how much emphasis, as you said, in terms of that time allocation do you need to put to it? Because what's the long-term benefit of having some of those qualities? I think like there's a very strong push towards developing a very broad, general approach, but I think the long-term sort of understanding has to be on like how much value that actually has to them. And we spoke about this, when we were talking before about like, do they need those tools in the toolkit? How often are they going to need to use them? Because I think sometimes, you give people tools that they're not going to need to use because of the lack of variability in, say, the things that we do. But in a sport, say like you work in rugby, there's never going to be a time where having reduced strength qualities is beneficial. Because the variability of the sport is such that you're going to be exposed to the requirements at so many different levels, whether it's in tackling, whether it's in contact, whether it's, changing direction, whether it's jumping, whether, it's all of these different factors. You need to have the strength qualities across all of those. You need all of those strength quality tools to be able to pull out in that, in that task or that sport.
Yeah, and overcome the constant inertia of people running into you.
Yeah. Well, we spoke about, like, for instance, with distance runners, a lot of them get away with having very poor flexibility.
Yes.
It's like, well, yeah, you can because you're running in a straight line at, in a relative sense, nowhere near your maximal output. You need enough range of motion so that under the high number of stress cycles that you're going through, you don't fail.
Yes.
But at the same time, it's not dire if they don't. And there's been lots of them that get away with it. Same with strength qualities in distance runners. I'm sure you've probably had arguments like I have with, distance coaches when you say like they would really benefit from getting a hell of a lot stronger because they don't have these qualities. It doesn't always limit them from being very high level performers in their event because the task doesn't require it.
Yeah, and we spoke about this a few weeks ago, but it also makes sense too from a specificity and needs for a distance runner where most of your time is going to be building up their aerobic capacity. But as that window of adaptation reduces, we know that you're going to see positive adaptations from strength training because they're going to build up tendon stiffness.
Yeah, and that's exactly what Lachlan was saying, how you need to specify once they get to a certain level of training exposure.
Yeah. Well, it's probably similar with strength then too, because it seems that we see certain thresholds once you reach strength, the actual benefit or transfer it has is going to become less and less.
If you're squatting 3 times your body weight, at what point do you need to continue trying to get to 3.2?
Yeah, and this is really a really important point in the whole context of strength and conditioning, and sort of goes to your earlier point before, and probably something important to talk about is, so strength and conditioning is there to support the sport, right? The primary stimulus for getting better at your sport is playing your sport and practicing your sport and training your sport. So if your sport is track and field or your sport is long distance running, then your training for that is going to be your primary mode of training, right? And so everything else is going to be there to support that. So
in terms of that, because this is a discussion, I don't know if you know Brady Green, who was at Latrobe for a bit. He was a physio at Essendon. He did the Masters as well. But we spoke with him about how sometimes there's some flaws in the current practice for both the medical staff and the sports performance staff on thinking that things transfer more than they do outside of the sporting field setting. Is that something that you're educating these people coming through your masters now of like understand where our position of support is and how much that's going to transfer to their ability to actually perform their sport? It's never going to be
not going to be able to
a cause effect.
Yeah, that's right.
Like
I think it's easy to forget that.
Yeah.
And so I certainly with us, it's understanding the S&C's role within the whole performance model of everything, right? It's easy to think that your bit is the bit that matters.
We all think that, like I'm the most important.
And I've got a PhD student now, Shane Lahane, who's the S&C at the Sydney Swans, who's kind of looking at the S&C's role within the whole puzzle,
Yeah,
the whole
it's
picture,
interesting.
right? And how you can kind of rank and quantify that. Because, first of all, you got to find out what's the S&C's role within the whole performance model. That's going to change depending on not just your sport, but the organisation within a given sport as well, and the resources associated with that. And then after you've done all that, which most people don't do, then you can start to look down at maybe the needs analysis of the sport itself, and then your role in that. And so, nothing you ever do in S&C when you're dealing with, team-based sports that aren't kind of measured sports is ever going to be cause and effect. You're never going to cause, the team to win, right? Or that cause that person to go from elite to sub-elite or to make the starting side, right? So you're just trying to develop the underpinning kind of mechanism that's going to allow them to perform well, but you're never going to cause that. And so to look for a cause and effect in such a dynamic system just isn't going to happen. You could perhaps start to look at that as you get to more measured sports like track and field. You could start to maybe tie in and look at measured transfer of training. But for most of the sports that we'll deal with in the complex ones where they're like this interrelated dynamic system that's always moving and changing, there's no cause and effect. You just have to identify what the primary qualities are, and you do that through sort of those empirical associations. Okay, what do the high level performers have that the lower level performers don't have? What distinguishes the two groups? What doesn't? What's most associated with ladder position? That sort of stuff. And then you can go, okay, these seem to be important, and then that's what we target.
How do you think that you mentioned organisation, and I always think about this of like, how do you think that changes based on, say, the coaching style and, say, for instance, like the tactical style of the coach? Because I think one of the things that I've noticed, and this is much more at amateur level in the sporting clubs that I worked at, is there's often a mismatch, like the support staff are like, we're going to do this type of, preparation, whether it's short, fast, or lots of endurance, but the actual coaches, the style they want to play with is complete opposite to that. Do you think that in itself, presents interesting and creative sort of problems for the performance stuff?
Yeah, it's funny. So that's interrelated with the topic that Shane will be looking at for his PhD. Shout out to Shane if he's listening. Yeah, I know. Is supporting the high performance model, or supporting the game model. Is so coaches will have a game model, and that will differ depending on the coach. And does the game model reflect the group of players and their physical qualities?
That's an interesting.
Or do you go the other way? Is you've got a game model and then you recruit players based on that?
Do you think that's something that, as professionals working in sports performance, you should be helping to inform the coaches? Like, this is actually who we have. This is the group that we've got. These are the qualities they have. We may be better to suit towards this style of, as you said, game mode or model or whatever it is, because they don't have, if
you've done all your measurements, you've collected data.
Exactly. Well, I always think about this, like a coach wants to play a really high level of endurance capability, but you selected players and none of them have, elite endurance qualities. It's going to take you a hell of a long time as a sports performance staff to drum in these qualities that these people are not built to do, and they'll get better at them. But how much better is probably being limited by their profile.
Well, and also I think you can relate that to injury prevalence too, because
I think that happens a lot, where you get players being exposed to a game style that really doesn't suit their profile, and the coach wants to use them for a particular sort of tactical thing or a position that they want them to play. And it's like, that doesn't suit them at all.
Well, it's like that article I suggested we talked about before with looking at the fibre typology of soccer players or football players. Do you even need to further subgroup athletes within a team to go like, look, you're someone who just runs around the field all day. We need to target.
You're a midfielder, yes.
Yeah. Versus like you walk 90% of the time, but every now and then you explode to.
And like the interesting thing with that is, I think when players are better, they get away with it. So, for instance, like I don't know, you would have seen it was published the GPS data that came out from Lionel Messi. Did you see that?
Oh, I think I've heard about it. I don't know if I.
It was more in a popular article, and I think actually it was published through Catapult. But they basically said like he walks more than most players, but what he does is he's intelligent. He'll watch the game and he'll walk to positions that create space. But he's not working harder from a physical output point of view in terms of, if you look at his GPS data, he's not running more than other people, and particularly not at low speeds. He just kind of walks around, and then he said he'll explode. and clearly he's one of the best players in the world, but he gets away with being able to play like that because the coaches probably go, well, he's so good, let's let him do what he wants. Whereas I'm sure you've been in this situation as well, and I'm sure some of your PhD students are dealing with this. It's like, well, that play's not suited to that. And the coach goes, no, but we want them to do this, and tell them to stop walking around and like,
it's a funny one. So on that messy one, I feel like he's the person that people use to say you don't need to do strength conditioning, because I've had
I'm not arguing
No,
that. Soccer, well, for some reason, European football or world soccer it's a fucking bunch of idiots letting players who can do things with the ball get away with not doing S&C. So
No. It's funny, right? Because I'm not saying you are, but I've just... This is over the 10 years, right? 10 years, I remember.
It's like those stupid videos. You see those stupid videos that came out of Barcelona and they're jumping around on fucking balls and just being absolute dickheads.
I could imagine. But see, that's, as you said, that's the exception, right? So that's not the norm. So if you took a batch of 100 of the best soccer players against 100 of the second-tier soccer players, and you saw who was faster or could jump higher and who had greater force output, you'd probably say, on average, those that are the high-level ones would do that. So as a result, it's important. But then, in saying that too, so you've got strength, you've got sports performance or invasion sports performance, which is a dynamic system, and then you've got agility, which is the ability to kind of read the play and react to some sort of a stimulus. And that's a really important part of on-field performance. And it's kind of at the point where the S&C's coach almost rolls over to the technical, tactical coaches, where there's this interrelationship there. And so then you start talking about, your small-sided games to develop that. And you can strength-based training. We're going to change the pit size, change the number of players, change some of the rules to improve those on-field agility performances to allow people to be more tactically skillful without having to cover as much ground to get the job done. Or we're going to manipulate those games so that we actually want some sort of a metabolic stimulus. So, secondary priority is some sort of agility stimulus. Primary priority is I want a metabolic stimulus, but we want a bit of both. So we're going to open up the game a little bit. We're going to have wider boundaries. We're going to have kind of sort of less rules, a bit more free space. I'll cover more ground, but less agility and movement. So you got all that. But then to answer your other question is how the conversation might go in the high performance. And I think this is really important, where you need to kind of know your role, right? And you would be a case of sort of presenting the information, explaining what that is, and then leaving it there. The coach will have, and the high performance manager. So typically it might go from you to the high performance manager, who will understand everything, and then they'll have the meeting, and then the coach will make their decision. So it's just something for them to consider. They'll have 1,000 other things to consider beyond just the physical profile that you won't ever know about. So I think, that's part of your role, is presenting that information. And then a lot of the time they might already know that. They might go, look, this person's fast, so I want to play a fast game, but we've got a bunch of slow players. Maybe we have to change our game style. But I think it's not your role.
Is Shane saying that's happening? Is there discussions like that occurring? And even I always think about too, then are we being involved in the information sort of side of things when it comes to recruitment as well? We're actually missing this kind of type of athlete, these type of qualities.
Yeah, and I think we'll come to find out as the research unfolds. But I feel like it's a case of you take the best players while they're available and you figure it out later. Certainly, maybe in Australian sports, I don't know if it's different in Europe with soccer, where maybe they recruit based on a game model. I'm not sure, but it's a really important question that we're looking to answer.
It makes me think of AFLW for its example, because you're seeing a relatively high injury prevalence, more from the standpoint of lack of physical development prior to actually them playing. And it's is that something that's been taken into consideration before they actually go and start playing, let alone when they actually get picked?
Well, the question that I have, and I think this is obviously with your level of experience, Lachlan, how do you see our, as professionals in this area, being able to help and inform and improve the quality of that stuff? Is that something that you're trying and hoping to do with this Masters?
Yeah. So are you talking about sort of improving the understanding of the S&C's role in the process? Or?
No, more about how, because I think you brought up a point before about, say, getting more involved in, say, some of the tactical and technical sort of prescription. And I see that like that's where the profession is going.
Yeah.
Where your understanding of how you can implement things within, say, the training field is going to get better and better and better, and being able to even apply technical information, maybe not necessarily about, say, kicking, but about like when you change direction in there, when you're doing that, when you took off in your acceleration, when you jumped for that, these are the features that we're going to work on in this setting and on the field and blah, 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 blah.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's,
where are we going as a profession?
There's a saying in S&C, it's a big S and a little C.
Yeah.
You know, and so
Does conditioning you feel like get neglected? Yeah.
It does. And I think that's a big issue. I think in Australia, we probably do it pretty well compared to others. So then some might say, well, then maybe you're not focusing enough on strength, for example. But I think it's easy to get caught up in the weight room. Maybe that's where we feel most comfortable because a lot of us are doing that anyway. You're probably maybe not spending so much time designing small-sided games for yourself. So people might feel less comfortable out there, and as a result, it gets neglected. But that's an issue, and it's something that needs to be kind of looked at because it represents a major part of preparation for sport is the stuff you do out there on the pitch. And this ranges from speed training through to, change of direction and agility through to developing your endurance qualities too. So
it turns out fatigue resistance is actually a pretty useful quality.
Through to thunk it. So it's really important to get comfortable out there. And that's a big part of our program too. We really went in designing the masters with that knowledge. We're like, look, we know where the weaknesses are. We know where we want students to feel comfortable. And so focusing on, that development out on the pitch, being comfortable out there.
What kind of stuff have you put into the program that you think does differentiate you from other programs?
Well, so the structure of the program itself is kind of different to other ones because it's got a considerable face-to-face component too. So it's 18 months full-time, kind of usual structure there, with a research project in the last semester. So that's kind of a postgraduate honours equivalent, which you can lay eligibility into a PhD, and you'll do that probably embedded with a club most of the time or with one of our projects. But leading up to that, you've got your 2 semesters, so 1 year worth of coursework, right? And the way that's structured is within semester 1, you'll do a 1-week face-to-face block. You come in for 1 week, kind of 9 to 5, Monday to Friday at the start of that semester, and then again at the end of the semester. So 2 1-week blocks where you get all your face-to-face stuff in, and then you do stuff online around that, and you do that again in semester 2. So you get these strong, solid doses of face-to-face upskilling, as well as the ability to kind of do it online, or you could come in from interstate and do it as well. And so that general structure is kind of unique too. So you get the face-to-face, you'll get hours. We also embed you within an organisation in your second semester, so you do placement, right? And that'll get you your ASCA hours to get at ASCA level 2. So 150 odd hours there. So that's what distinguishes probably the program overall. But then from a content perspective, we've got a whole subject on developing speed, endurance, and agility. So we've got a whole subject on developing strength qualities. And so that speed, endurance, agility, you're out there on the pitch that whole time, getting comfortable with that, delivering training, assessing, GPS, everything associated with that as well. So that's a big part of it and something we focused on. So that's how we're kind of trying to tackle that, giving them exposure to it.
You mentioned before that, you're involved in both the sports science and the S&C side of things. How do you think that's sort of tracking within these bigger organizations? Because sometimes, you're expected to do both.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's stay in your lane. How do you sort of see that kind of developing over time?
Yeah, definitely an issue. What you'll find is clubs maybe, particularly at the lower tiers, semi-pro, they're going to be short on resources, right? So you're going to have to wear all the hats. Yeah. And that's actually really good for your development. So
yeah, I see so too. I think one of the things that younger practitioners often want to do, they want to go to the highest level as quickly as possible. But they don't realize you end up getting limited in what you get exposed to because they say, this is your job is to, mark down
that's it.
This, these numbers in the gym,
whatever it is. It's
you're not doing anything else.
Yeah, but those sort of the lower tier, you're doing everything. So you'll be most probably the S&C coach, you'll be the sports scientist, you'll be the rehab person, you'll wear all caps, right? And so that's pretty common. So you need to make sure you're confident in all areas. So although it's a Masters of Strength and Conditioning, we've got a fair bit of applied sports science in there, as part of that too. So that's what happens. As you might move up the ranks, the professions or the disciplines may start to differ a little bit. And the big difference is, so a strength and conditioning coach, they coach, right? So they'll be delivering training, whereas none of the other disciplines, so whether it's the physiotherapist, whether it's a sports scientist, nutritionist or whatever, massage therapist, no one's delivering training. It's the S&C coach. That's probably where they differ from, say, maybe the sports scientist role, who might be looking at a lot of subdisciplines. Sports scientists could cover anything from recovery through to data and GPS, through to maybe strength diagnostics, through to motor control as well. So there's a fairly broad spectrum, and it just depends on what the demands of the organisation are. So maybe if you're at an institute of sport or like the AIS or the QAS, maybe you're a sports scientist, but maybe a biomechanist kind of a role. Whereas maybe if you're in a club, maybe you're a kind of sports scientist with a bit of a data role or something like that. So it does depend.
I was actually going to ask, related to that, do you see within the strength and conditioning world more and more specialisation, where like you see a coach becoming more focused or identified with one particular, say, training modality or one particular ability to focus on doing hypertrophy?
Is that good or bad?
Well, that's the question. Yeah. And I don't think that's the best thing, because
we agree with you. In short,
it's got to be based on what's best for the given situation, and the situation will change. So I don't think it's so good to be known as this person or that person.
Yet, even though that becomes very popular from a marketing standpoint, I think,
and even probably from a financial standpoint, clubs will, for instance, get in this specialist in an area of having this problem, whether it's an injury, whether it's we want to work on speed, or we want to, and you get pigeonholed into that, but it may not be the best for that person.
It's that issue of, if all you've got is a hammer, everything looks like nails. You're the strength guy, and you come and do some measurement. You're like, they seem to get their strength up, and perhaps they do. But it's more of, well, if you actually have broad knowledge and you can actually identify or collect data over many domains, you may start to get an indication of where are the deficits, and that potentially lies over multiple factors.
Yeah, I think it's really important. And it's probably important to distinguish between sports science and S&C in this conversation. Within sports science, I think you could see a role for a really deep specialization in a particular area.
Yeah, sure.
Within strength and conditioning, you've got to develop all physical qualities, and you've got to use all the tools at your disposal to best develop those physical qualities. And that might change depending on not just the common things like the athlete and sport, but how much equipment you've got around you, sort of resources you have, how much time you have with them, how capable they are, all those things. So I think that's in that sort of notion, it's important to be a bit of a generalist in S&C. Sports science, I think you can start to really,
even some of those areas you've said, like the biomechanics, that in itself has so many elements to it as well.
Oh yeah, how deep down any rabbit hole you want to go, right? And you can do that.
Whilst on that topic, one thing I often think about clinically is you're focusing on developing multiple components, physical factors at once, because in the real world, you're focused on outcomes. You don't really care how you get there. You just want them to reach a certain point to be able to perform at a high level. But similar to what you said before, that also limits your ability to identify cause effect. But it's also a question you need to ask yourself, can we ever identify that anyway? Because we actually quite are dynamic, complex systems. But I was interested, do you know of any research, or is there like interest in doing research of focusing more on looking at the interaction of developing multiple biomotor abilities at once, as opposed to the very controlled setting where you're just focusing on developing one element?
Yeah, I think that's a big space, and not just within the biomotor, which is kind of like the strength quality type balance, but broadening across all of the domains, like particularly when it comes to agility as well, which historically might have been a very reductionist approach, which is sort of a biomechanist type approach, but now there's a sort of dynamic complex systems approach lens through which we're looking at that, and that becomes kind of a motor control or skill performance type thing. So that's really where it's going. I think when you're looking into the specific strength qualities, I think you can be a bit more reductionist because it does become fairly biomechanist.
Well, I'm probably talking more broadly in terms of developing, whether it's got to do with force-producing capacity, metabolic capacity, even like, all the other things that we think about in the real world, whether it's sleep, diet, all these things that we're going to typically address at once.
Yeah, and I think there's a role for being reductionist, and I've certainly taken that approach in many ways, but I think it's also important to consider the complex system approach to in certain domains where it's really important. Sometimes you have to kind of dial it into a few specific things. Other times you might have to look at the interaction between all of the elements too. But I do think that the research is really considering, in fact, I think it's almost kind of trendy now to be looking at the whole dynamic complex systems approach to understanding adaptations and training and transfer.
Yeah, well, it makes a lot of sense, I think, too, in terms of real world application, because you as a S&C coach, as a clinician, are only going to respond to the data that's in front of you, as opposed to, no, we're just going to follow this particular formula. You're going to really have to base it on individual analysis. Yeah,
and I think that's when you're looking at the real holistic approach. I think if you're focusing on the strength conditioning side of things, what you're really doing is you're trying to allow that person or the performer more time to perform a given skill. So they'll be able to get to the position they need to get to quicker because they're faster, stronger, and as a result have more options. Yes. So that's probably the interaction between strength and conditioning and a skilled outcome or a skilled performance is, you're not trying to develop skill, but by improving the physical qualities, it allows them more time to make an informed decision because they can get to a point quicker, they can manage the fatigue better, they can handle the collision to a greater extent. And so that's probably where you'd see it fit into that whole pathway or that whole process.
I even think of it too from like a sensory motor perspective, how they actually complete the task, because as you build more capacity in the system, the sensory motor output is going to change based on the tools available to complete that particular task. And I think that makes a lot of sense also from an injury prevention standpoint too.
It's interesting, right? So, and then that brings on the notion of adapting to multiple stresses, right? And the more stresses you're exposed to, the harder it is to adapt. So, I think it's sort of based on some of the old biological principles from the 1920s, where the more stimuli you're exposed to, the harder it is to adapt. But if you've just got kind of one stimulus, this is where periodization comes in at a time that you can kind of adapt to, you'll adapt better. So you got to kind of, but you only have so much control in sport, right? So you can't just go, well, no one's doing any of this, and we're going to do all of that. That's not going to work. So you kind of
you've done the kilometres, you're off the field now.
Yeah, not going to do that for 3 weeks because we're going to do just this now. It's not. So you're going to work on priorities and dosages rather than none of this and all of this and saturating it. So
when you can't control everything, all the stresses that goes on someone's life too, because
that's right.
Physical factors, there's a lot of non-physical systemic components to it too.
Yeah, that's right. So complex system, you've got to consider it all. If you can find a way to weight and prioritize and look how that changes across time and look how each of the factors influence the other factors, I think that's what you should be looking at. And that's part of that holistic integrated periodization process that we move towards these days.
Yeah, I think.
Do you want to explain that a bit more for people who probably haven't heard it?
Yeah, so
how you actually apply that more holistic periodization process?
Yeah, so periodization is sort of the integration of training tasks across time to reach very specific goals and events. So it's organising your training across time. So it's your big long-term picture, right, rather than sort of the small micro pictures. And, historically we may have just thought of that as the training side of things, but more contemporarily we're looking at things like how recovery fits in, how nutrition fits in, how skill acquisition fits in to that periodization process. So how those factors change across time and how those factors interact with our other more familiar physical type factors over time. So that's what we mean by integrated periodization.
Yeah, I know Greg Haff often used to talk about it, something I definitely agree with, where people confuse periodization with programming, where, it's essentially trying to give you some organization of stresses over time. It's not going to tell you that in 12 weeks you're going to do these particular sessions because, well, the reality is you don't know where that person's going to be.
Yeah, that's right.
In terms of their physical capacity at that point in time, therefore what's necessary to focus on.
And it gives you a framework to construct what the plan will look like, and the plan can be somewhat dynamic. There are some fundamental principles which will always hold true, sequencing from one to the other and any sort of interference effect, and the interaction between stimulus, fatigue, adaptation, and all of that stuff that you'll be considering. But it is dynamic. But I think the take-home point is contemporarily, we're really looking at bringing in these other factors like recovery and skill acquisition and nutrition, and even, maybe rehabilitation components into the whole process.
How do you think that sort of fits in with some of the concepts and discussions around things like auto-regulation? Obviously, I think it obviously works more in individual sports. I think that probably becomes an enormous challenge for practitioners in a team setting. But do you think that there's a role for that kind of approach to allow that more integrated periodization planning?
Yeah, so the auto-regulation, and it's probably important to clarify what we're talking about here too, because it could mean a number of different things.
Agree.
So it might be a case of, of determining what your capacity is at that moment in time, right? And then based upon your capacity at that instant in time, you make a decision on what's going to happen. So it depends on how far you swing your decision. So, for example, VBT is a really good way of what people might call auto-regulatory, but really it's just sort of measuring your strength at that instant in time as opposed to basing your decisions off the strength test you did 6 weeks ago, right?
Assuming that that's going to be always accurate, that you can base a percentage off a 1RM test.
Yeah, so then there's a lot of variability. You might be able to do 5 reps at 80%. You might be able to do 8 reps at 80%. That's a variation of probably, 80% variance there.
You see that massive variability in aerobic trained athletes versus...
Yeah, so that's your workhorse and Maseratis, right? So that's one thing. That's an issue with percentage-based training, but, but there's issues with everything. Then there's, maybe they just came off the pitch and, the coach made them do 30% more work or 100% more work than you banked on. And as a result, they're acutely fatigued, right? So that 70% on the bar now probably actually represents more like 85, 90% on the bar, which isn't what you had planned. So the way you can address that amongst RTE, which is probably going to be a really good way to go too, is you look at the velocity of the bar, and if it's moving slower than you planned, then you've got to take off weight so it moves at velocity. So that's kind of the one way of interpreting auto regulation, and I think that's actually a pretty sensible approach because you're working within their strength of the day. But here's the problem: is if you go change the whole program as a result of that, if you go now because you're fatigued, we're going to do hypertrophy, not power, or we're going to do power, not hypertrophy, or something like that. That's a problem, right?
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things that we notice with people, particularly idiot physios, pulling people out of stuff because of things like that, where they're like, oh, you hit your kilometers, so you're doing this, or you're not doing this, or you didn't hit your kilometers, so we're going to go make you run. Like I heard a story recently of someone hurting themselves. I think it was actually just a news report. Someone hurting themselves in the post-game top-up running. And I was like, that's the dumbest fucking thing I've ever heard. Hurting someone in the post-game top-up is fucking stupid, if you ask me, right? And you might disagree with me. That's good if you do. But to me, the reason that I think...
Why do you think it's so stupid?
What's your motivation as a player who sat on the bench the whole game to do more running? Particularly if it's a night game, which I think it was. Zero,
yeah.
Well, the motivation would be to keep your job.
Well, depends. As you know, most of the entitled professional players these days don't think about that. They just think about themselves. So there's a balance with that. But you actually have to think about the discussion with that player. Like, when do we put this in? If we know you're not going to get many minutes, do I put it in at 10:30 at night when you've sat on the bench for 2 hours and it's cold? Like, I don't know that that's genius either.
Yeah, there's complicated sort of situations, right? The role of top-up is important because you're banking on a player getting a given amount of stress in a game. You've worked for that, and then as a result, they got sort of less than planned. Then you need to give them some sort of a stimulus. So it's about how you put that in. But these things are complicated, I think. I think there's sort of multifactorial problems as well.
Who pays the piper when it comes to someone getting injured there?
Well, again, it's a team, and I don't know what goes on behind the scenes and who blames who.
I think you highlighted a good point there, though. It is multifactorial. Like,
Yeah.
I think the problem that happens is when you're basically just off one bit of data, like i.e. how many kilometers you've run, without taking into consideration other factors that are going to influence fatigue on the system, whether they be like physical factors of, related to like different running speeds, but even like non-physical factors. You just lost a game by a goal and you're feeling like absolute shit. Or, you've got some other type of psychological or emotional stresses. Those things are going to have a big impact on your susceptibility to injury and how good or fatigued that you feel.
Well, it always reminds me of that when I heard on paper, the one where he's saying, people don't tear their hamstring coming first in a race.
I reckon the best one is because, we look at 100-meter sprinters, they're all puffing at the end. The guy who won, he's just bouncing along. He's doing laps of the track.
Yeah, it's interesting, man. Yeah, I don't know. I just think it's an interesting kind of conundrum to play with. And I think that, I think that probably brings to that point of, like, you mentioned using things like BBT, but other factors. Like, do you think that that's the approach then you have to take of, what's the output that I'm seeing? And therefore, it's hard to know what the actual interactions and interplay was between what led to that output being down, so whether it's the strength measure after coming off the pitch and doing just the 30% more work. Is it about us kind of recognizing what the output is at that current point and making an appropriate decision about what they're capable of to maintain a level of stress that's appropriate?
Yeah, so I think, again, it sort of depends on the setting. So we're talking about if you've got a whole squad and then the barbells are all moving slower than you expected for the weight you've chosen, representing 85%. If it's all moving slower, then they're probably all being equally as fatigued just through training or competition and more than you banked on. So as a result, you alter the loading on the bar so that it represents the velocity that you would associate with the chosen percentage, right? Well, what you're probably not doing is just changing everything.
Yeah.
So that's one way. If you see an individual or a small group of players where it seems to be different from the rest, then maybe it's a case of it's probably a conversation starter, see if there's anything else going on, other things, other factors, and that's where you can maybe identify causes for that decreased performance that you might see. And that's where you'd be, bringing other people in there. Maybe it's just easily explained, you don't have anything to worry about. Most of the time, probably don't have much to worry about. But using the barbell velocity, that could be quite helpful because often strength level fluctuates more often than you test it. That's kind of the take home point. And I think it can be really helpful. You really probably only going to be using that for a couple of your KPI lifts, and probably when they're already pretty well developed lifters. It might be able to get in the way. Might get in the way sometimes if you're dealing with some developmental lifters. It might just be annoying, and you just need to focus on kind of your coaching there as well. So, but I think the velocity can be a helpful way of understanding fatigue state, certainly within the weight room, and then making some easy informed decisions or opening up a conversation which may or may not lead to something.
What type of measures do you use, John, in your coaching with looking at fatigue?
Fatigue?
Yeah.
In what aspect? You mean the gym?
Well, probably more general too. Like you use different ones depending on what the session is.
Yeah.
Give us you don't use velocity-based stuff in the gym, do you?
Yeah.
You do? Okay.
Yeah, whether it's velocity-based stuff in the gym, as what the gym aware.
Do you use it for your heavy lifts or for your more ballistic type plyometric lifts, or the whole thing?
Both,
Yeah. So for your ballistic stuff, how would you use it? Would you use it for feedback so that they know they've actually given a max effort, or would you use it to go?
They're using feedback, and I'm using it probably more for feedback. They're using it for feedback. I'm probably using it more for benchmarking and monitoring that, but also looking at how fatigued they are.
Yeah.
So it's really clear, like, as you would probably attest to, particularly in speed power athletes, I think the velocity of their movements in barbell exercises will tend to go down before their actual maximal force output does.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. It's more kind of sensitive to fatigue.
So
anything bouncy or jumpy. You kind of see that.
Yeah, and so, like, to me, it's usually a giveaway sign. And it doesn't mean that you change it. It just means that, they're actually a little bit more fatigued than what I maybe was expecting when I prescribed this session.
Or maybe you planned for them to be fatigued. Maybe you're
that's part of it. Overreaching a little bit.
Right. That's to be expected, and they'll bounce back up in 4 or 5 weeks' time, even better than before.
Yeah, it just depends on that. But yeah, so in the gym, that obviously, we've got the Kaiser squats, so we're using that quite a bit in terms of their power output, in terms of watts. On the track, obviously, we're using time. Use different timing systems. I did play with it a while ago, which I haven't gone back to. I'm thinking about doing it again. Was going back and looking at using GPS actually for speed measures. But they don't seem to have the sensitivity that I would like.
In terms of max speeds they reach or acceleration rates or both?
Max speeds, yeah.
Yeah, it's pretty common these days, taking your speed measures from GPS as opposed to setting up your sprints and timing gates. Just from a organisation perspective, it's a bit easier. Yeah. So it's not uncommon. I think you're starting to see a bit more of that these days.
The only thing is that, I guess now it's a bit easier because you can look at it in time there. It probably doesn't give you necessarily the segments we want to use from a execution
splits.
For certain splits, because we're looking at, say, actual race execution point. But I'm thinking of using both, so I kind of get information on both of those. And then obviously there's more general, as you know, some of the more general ones. There's a few systems that we've used. The one that I
was going to ask you about whether Lachlan's. Many of S&C coaches use some of the stuff like the Omega
Wave. Yeah, I quite like that system.
Or a ring.
So for those sort of systems, I know Omega Wave at least wasn't probably still as used at the UFC Performance Institute. So that's sort of used as a measure of fatigue. For, say, like velocity measurement devices, I've actually used probably all of them, I'd say.
Yeah, there's lots of different options now. And even there's a few, I'm pretty sure that they've actually now added bar velocity onto some of the, Carlos has added to some of his.
Yeah, so there's an app you can just download for free on your phone. I've tested it out and looked at, some my own quick validation of it.
Is it reasonable?
Yeah, it's not bad. You consider it's for free and you can just get all your students to put on their phone and they can take it off to their own practice. I think it can be really helpful.
Yeah. So gives you at least a ballpark, I guess.
Yeah, I think it's actually not bad considering. So, they're all, I think there's a lot of good options out there these days, and it really depends on your price point and what you want to use it for as well. If you've got kind of a large squad and you've got a tight budget and you really just want that kind of quick feedback, the push band can be great. If you're wanting something that's a little bit more valid, might be able to give you a bit more detail, comes at a higher price point, and you're going to go with the GymAware. And then they've got the GymAware Flex, which can go just directly onto the barbell, so it saves you kind of mucking around with tethers. That can be a good approach too. There are a couple of, I won't mention any names. There's a couple of devices out there that just don't work.
I'm sure there's plenty of those.
Yeah.
They miss reps, and if you can't go too fast, you can't go too slow. So you got to go just right. And you're like, what's the point of that? But all the ones we kind of know about, we know about for a reason because they're pretty solid.
Yeah. They've been tested a reasonable amount for reliability.
Oh, yeah. And the reliability has been studied pretty much to death for the most part. And they're all pretty solid. Some are better than others and normally reflects the price point that you're going for. Some you'd be comfortable using for research. Others you just keep for practice. So there's lots of good ones out there. I think we're in a good stage these days, to be honest, particularly when you get an app on your phone and it can give you that velocity feedback and you can, hey, look, I was this far off failure. I felt like that, or actually had more left in the tank than I thought. And then you can give that to students to go out there and to use on their own. In addition to, they come and spend time with us and we got everything. But it's good for them to go out and do it themselves.
Well, one of the areas that, sort of changing topics a little bit, so I apologize, but one of the areas that was interesting, because you mentioned one of the big differentiators between S&C and other areas of, say, sports performance is the coaching side of things. How much do you take the students into pedagogy and understanding teaching? Is that something that you spend a fair bit of time on? Because I think it's one of the really neglected areas, and it takes a long time, I think, to become a good coach.
Yeah, that's a good question.
But you see, and I see this a lot with younger practitioners. I get a lot of students who come in, I had one recently do their hours with me and all this kind of stuff. And they have the problem they overcoach because they actually are still very early in the game and they're not really that aware of how much they're saying. And they're trying to obviously show people what they know.
They assume more is better, so to speak.
Yeah, and as we all do this as coaches, we overcoach. Particularly early on in your career. So how much time do you spend on this kind of the pedagogical side of things?
It's an important part, when we're developing the Masters of Strength Conditioning, along with identifying, giving them time out on the pitch, getting the conditioning up so that from a little C to a big C, was the actual delivery of coaching. So Latrobe actually has a Bachelor of Sports Coaching degree, which is, might be wrong, but I think it might be the only undergrad degree in Australia in sports coaching. There are master's degrees out there. And so as a result, there's that influence within our masters.
Did you sort of collaborate with them to kind of?
Yes, they're part of our discipline. They're part of our sport exercise science team, and so Maris Liddams takes care of that role within the Masters of Strength Conditioning. So we've got principles and practices of coaching and strength and conditioning as a standalone subject within the first semester. So along with speed, agility, and endurance, strength and power, and training and monitoring, we've got coaching.
Yeah.
So which tackles all those things you were describing, and then they move into the second semester and kind of build on that. So that's a really big part of it. It's something we knew was always going to be an important feature and a critical feature of that. Give them all the technical knowledge, but if you can't communicate that, and if you can't sort of manage yourself in the right environment, in the stresses of a high performance environment, then it's going to be hard. And that's what that sports coaching component of the degree does. So we're really proud of that.
Yeah. You mentioned just then the stresses of the performance environment. Do you think that it is difficult as someone who is a practitioner that, as I said, you're part of the team, and you're not necessarily always going to have the ability to make those changes? Do you think that that's something that's discussed enough, where people go into these roles and it's not coming from anywhere malicious, like you're gung ho because you've got knowledge and you want to help, but you're not always going to be able to influence that. Do you think that as a profession we speak about that kind of stuff, like navigating somewhat the politics of elite sport?
No, we don't, which is why we really try to cover it in ours. So, for example, Maris, who's our lecturer in that, we'll set up role plays, really challenging situations, so here's your program, and then, he'll role play of what would happen in the real world when things don't go the way you planned, how you deal with that stressful situation.
Deal with different personalities.
Yeah, 100%.
And I know you mentioned it before, Lachlan, like head coaches have lots of stresses that they're dealing with, and sometimes they blame everyone else except themselves.
You must have a psychology unit in there, don't you, really?
Sure, yeah. And
less coaching, isn't it?
That is, yeah, it's a big part of it. So you've got that component, and then, as part of your placement in second semester, maybe if you're lucky, you get to be in some of those situations. And you get to apply those challenging skills and see how you cope with it. But that's huge, right? That's what will crush most people.
I think that's what gets people out of high performance sport after a period of time. Like I've noticed a really reasonable trend of people who got quite senior, even get to the point of being like, say, high performance managers. And a lot of them have moved into the school systems because I think the stresses, the lifestyle, being able to have a family, all those kind of things has become easier. And I don't know that we're always discussing this. We have this issue, obviously I work across both sports performance and physio, but with physio as well, they think that they're getting into high performance sport because it's glamorous and all these things, but you're working 7 days a week and people are calling you in the middle of the night at times. It's not necessarily something that people are prepared for until they get thrust into it.
I think the other issue too is how much autonomy you have in that situation. That seems to be another thing too.
Yeah, it seems very limited.
Yeah, like if you're not in an open environment, it's like, this is what we do, this is how we treat this injury, this is how we develop the athletes. And it's like, well, what about input? This is the system that we have. And that also can be a bit of a
challenge,
a bit of a backbreaker in that sense of like, well, I don't just want to replicate what you want me to do. I want to have some level of autonomy.
Yeah, you raised a good point, about the challenges of working in sort of high performance sport. And I just came from catching up with a PhD student of mine, Pat Holmberg, who's doing his PhD with me and Vince Kelly through QUT. But Pat's from the States, and he's got nearly 20 years experience in the NCAA system. And he made a good point just before. He goes, how many S&C coaches' retirement parties have you been to? Well, zero. So just kind of disappear and fade away, and
they walk away out,
and so that's a real issue. It's not just, I think it's the whole wider industry. And what you'll see is exactly what you described, and that's people will have an exit strategy, and that's people sort of like a lot of the people that I work with.
Go into academics.
Yeah, that's right. It's a pretty good way to go because you can get the best of both worlds.
Yeah, you get to be involved in these high level questions and pique your interest and be curious.
That's right. And look behind the curtain occasionally, but you
actually have some framework of occupational, safety
that
doesn't stop you from being in the office at 10 o'clock at night.
So it's a pretty common pathway. Yeah. Others might go on alternate pathway. Others might go into, say, private practice, open up their own shop. But that brings with it its own stresses too. Others then go into the high school system, which is pretty sort of low stress and can be very rewarding. So, it does have a life expectancy, and sometimes through no fault of your own, regardless of how well you've done your job. There may not always be that job there for you.
That's a huge challenge, I think, because you often see that like regime changes, basically like a new coach comes in and goes, "Nah, everyone's out." I know that like one of our colleagues mentioned that happened quite a lot at one of the professional clubs that he was at, where new coach came in and said, "No, I'm bringing in all my own people," and that's kind of the deal that he did with the club. So,
and that's not uncommon.
A heap of people lost their jobs, and there's like, they're good at what they do, but they're gone.
But you get 1 year contracts typically. Yeah, that's it's not ongoing.
Yeah, it's tough, but you got to love the job, and those that are in it do. And along with that, they also consider exit strategies.
Well, there seems to be certain personality types that go into elite sport and stay in it too, it seems.
Yeah, it's not for the faint of heart. It's a jungle out there, and I think it can be challenging. But you would have all the rewards that come along with it. But I think for me, as an academic or an applied academic, you get to peek behind the scenes a little bit, having had a little bit of experience in the applied setting for a while. You kind of enjoy this role where you have sort of the best of both worlds. So it's pretty good. And, you get to see your PhD students sort of shine out there as well. And you assist them with their progression and their development, improving their practice and helping them move on to whatever it is they want to do in the future as well. Pretty rewarding.
Yeah, great. Should we finish it up there?
Yeah, I think we've probably covered off on most things. Thank you very much, Lachlan.
Yeah, thanks, fellas. Pleasure.
Today's podcast is brought to you with the support of Strength by Numbers, and in particular, their Assess It system. What is the Assess It system, Jack?
So the Assess It system includes a handheld dynamometer, which they call a push-it, a pull force transducer, and force plates. So this is equipment that we can use to measure force and velocity aspects related to force reduction. Have you found it useful, John?
It's been extremely useful for us in our clinical practice to get objective data on what our patients and particularly a lot of the sports people that we deal with, and the information that we can use from that to be able to change the management that we do with them.
Yeah, and the most obvious thing is we need to be able to collect data that we know is valid and reliable, because that's obviously going to inform what we do within our clinical practice. I think the other thing that's really useful about the Assess It system is the interface for presenting the data as well. So I think it's really well presented in terms of giving us graphs and also comparison to normative data, so we can get an indication of asymmetries or deficits relative to some of the general population data that's being collected.
If any of this sounds like something or a system that you would like to use in your clinical practice or sports performance setting, we suggest that you reach out to Strength by Numbers and tell them Melbourne Athletic Development have sent you. They'll be able to look after you and set you up with a system that's going to give you more information and allow you to get the best out of your practice.